nasty, nasty, nasty work, Tiffany Hayes. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. You are pushing for physical harm and violence on Caitlin Clark because she busted your you-know-what in a basketball game that you was doing a lot of trash talking into. This is nasty work.
The conversation surrounding this situation has now moved far beyond ordinary basketball rivalry, and that distinction matters more than people realize. Competitive tension, physical play, trash talk, and emotional confrontations are all part of professional sports. Leagues are built to handle those moments through referees, league reviews, fines, suspensions, and the disciplinary systems already written into the structure of the game. That environment is controlled, expected, and institutionally understood. But the moment conduct begins crossing from on-court competition into public digital behavior involving references to real-world harm directed at a specific individual, the entire situation enters a completely different category. One involving legal exposure, organizational responsibility, public relations risk, and league accountability at the highest level. And that is exactly why the Tiffany Hayes situation is now generating such intense scrutiny across the WNBA landscape. For weeks, the Indiana Fever controversy has centered around questions involving coaching decisions, locker room management, player treatment, and front office accountability. But today the focus shifts entirely. The central issue is no longer about rotations, officiating, or basketball strategy. The conversation now revolves around the public conduct of a verified professional athlete operating on a highly visible social media platform and the institutional response that follows. Because when an athlete with a major public platform interacts with content containing explicit references to off-court physical harm toward a named individual, leagues and corporate partners are forced to evaluate the situation under a far more serious lens than ordinary sports controversy. These are the kinds of situations modern professional leagues monitor extremely carefully because the reputational consequences can escalate rapidly. Welcome back to WNBA Pro. Today we are breaking this situation down with precision, context, and documented analysis. We are not here to sensationalize threats or amplify inflammatory content beyond what is necessary to establish the factual timeline. Our focus is on the professional standards involved, the institutional implications surrounding athlete conduct in public digital spaces, and what the WNBA's handling of this controversy may reveal about the league's consistency when it comes to discipline, accountability, and public messaging. Because regardless of where fans stand emotionally, situations like this ultimately become larger than individual rivalries. They become tests of how consistently a professional league chooses to enforce its own standards under public pressure. What makes this situation even more significant is the exact nature of the social media content Tiffany Hayes allegedly chose to engage with and the institutional responsibility that immediately creates for the WNBA league office, the Golden State Valkyries organization, and the WNBA Players Association itself. Because once a situation moves beyond competitive basketball and enters the territory of public digital behavior involving references to off-court harm, every major stakeholder attached to the league is suddenly forced into evaluation mode. And the timing could not be more politically sensitive for the league office. In the very same week the WNBA issued documented discipline against Stephanie White over criticism directed toward officiating. This controversy now raises a completely different question about enforcement consistency. Fans, media figures, corporate partners, and players are all watching to see whether the league applies the same level of urgency and accountability across every category of conduct or whether enforcement standards shift depending on the individuals involved. Now let us establish the sequence of events clearly because context matters here. The online reaction exploded almost immediately after reports and screenshots began circulating. And many fans reacted with genuine concern, especially considering the broader context already surrounding Caitlin Clark this season. Whether people want to acknowledge it or not, Clark has already dealt with documented security concerns, including reports involving an alleged stalker situation earlier in the year. That reality changes how people interpret any public references to off-court harm or intimidation directed toward her, even if some online users attempt to dismiss it as internet trolling or emotional fan behavior. Professional leagues do not have the luxury of casually ignoring these situations once they become public because modern athlete safety concerns are treated with enormous seriousness from both legal and public relations perspectives. The on-court confrontation itself is also important because it directly set the stage for everything that followed online. During the Indiana Fever's 90-82 victory over the Golden State Valkyries, Tiffany Hayes engaged in a visibly intense physical and psychological battle with Clark throughout portions of the game. At one point, the interaction escalated into direct face-to-face confrontation clearly designed to disrupt Clark's focus and competitive rhythm. Clark's response became one of the defining highlights of the night. A deep three-pointer from well beyond the standard range followed immediately by verbal engagement directed back at Hayes. In ordinary basketball terms, that moment falls squarely within the emotional intensity of elite competition. Those moments happen. They become viral clips. They fuel rivalries. But statistically, the aftermath of the exchange also became part of the documented game record. Hayes struggled to regain efficiency offensively, her production declined during key stretches, and the Valkyries ultimately lost the game by 8 points. Those are simply box score realities attached to the timeline of events. But the true institutional controversy began after the final buzzer when the social media activity entered public view. According to circulating reports and screenshots, one online user allegedly posted language implying off-court retaliation, including statements referencing people who would riot at dawn upon request, and suggesting outside involvement beyond basketball itself. That is the point where the situation stops being viewed merely as sports trash talk and instead becomes a question about professional conduct, digital responsibility, and league response standards. Because whether engagement with that content was intentional, careless, or misunderstood, the existence of the interaction alone is enough to trigger scrutiny in today's professional sports environment where leagues monitor public athlete behavior extremely closely. The reason this situation immediately crossed a major line for so many observers is because the language involved was no longer connected to basketball competition in any reasonable interpretation. According to the screenshots and circulating reactions, the message in question was not talking about hard fouls, trash talk, defensive pressure, or emotional intensity during a game. The message allegedly referenced people willing to commit physical harm against Caitlin Clark away from the court and outside the boundaries of professional competition entirely. That distinction is critical. Once references shift toward real-world violence against a named athlete in their personal life, leagues, organizations, and public figures are expected to treat the situation with an entirely different level of seriousness regardless of whether the original commenter intended it as a joke, exaggeration, or emotional internet rhetoric. Professional athletes with verified platforms are generally expected to avoid encouraging, validating, or publicly entertaining that type of language because of the institutional consequences attached to it. The controversy intensified because in the hours following the game, Tiffany Hayes reportedly interacted with multiple social media posts tied to the incident, including comments using the phrase "crash out," slang often associated with emotionally escalating toward reckless or physical behavior. On its own, internet slang may not necessarily trigger widespread backlash. But critics argue the situation changed dramatically once Hayes allegedly engaged with a separate message explicitly suggesting that family members or associates could be mobilized to harm Clark outside the basketball environment. The wording reportedly referenced being ready to riot at dawn upon request, language many observers interpreted as a direct reference to organized off-court retaliation rather than competitive sports banter. That is the exact point where the conversation shifted from ordinary online trash talk into a much more serious public relations and institutional controversy. According to the screenshots circulating online, Hayes responded to that message with a reply interpreted by many users as validating or encouraging the sentiment, reportedly writing, "That's real," alongside an emoji expressing amusement. That response became the central focus of the backlash almost instantly because critics viewed it as a verified professional athlete publicly engaging with rhetoric tied to off-court violence involving another player. And in the current sports climate, where athlete security concerns are already under heavy scrutiny across multiple leagues, that kind of interaction is almost guaranteed to trigger widespread public reaction. Supporters of Clark argued the exchange was reckless, irresponsible, and completely inappropriate given the broader context surrounding her visibility and documented security concerns this season. Others attempted to frame the interaction as unserious internet behavior taken out of context. But regardless of intent, the institutional problem for the WNBA is that once screenshots circulate publicly, perception itself becomes part of the story. That is why this controversy now extends far beyond a single emotional social media interaction. The larger question becomes whether the WNBA views public engagement with rhetoric implying off-court harm as conduct serious enough to warrant formal review, public response, or disciplinary action. Because if leagues aggressively enforce standards surrounding criticism of officiating, player conduct, and public professionalism in other contexts, observers are inevitably going to ask whether the same standards apply consistently here. And whether fair or unfair, that comparison is exactly what has now turned this situation into one of the most heavily debated controversies surrounding the league this week. The backlash escalated even further once fans and commentators began openly demanding disciplinary action from the WNBA itself. Many critics argued that a simple fine would not be enough, insisting the league would need to treat the situation as a serious conduct issue rather than just another social media controversy. Their argument was straightforward. This was no longer about basketball emotions spilling over after a heated game. The concern centered on the fact that a verified professional athlete allegedly gave a public affirmative response to content referencing off-court physical harm against another named player. And in the eyes of many observers, that immediately transforms the issue from competitive sports drama into something much larger involving league standards, player safety, corporate image, and institutional credibility. The institutional analysis here requires precision because the distinction matters. According to the screenshots and reports circulating online, Hayes did not publicly reject the language, report it, or clarify that she found it inappropriate. Critics argue that instead her response appeared to communicate agreement or amusement through both wording and emoji usage. Whether supporters interpret the interaction differently or not, the reason this became such a major controversy is because professional sports leagues operate under entirely different standards once public engagement involves references to violence toward identifiable individuals. At that point, the issue enters the realm of corporate conduct policies, risk management, and player welfare obligations rather than ordinary sports rivalry. What intensifies the scrutiny surrounding this particular case is the broader context involving Caitlin Clark herself. Clark is not simply a random public figure receiving generic online criticism. Reports earlier this season already placed attention on security concerns surrounding her visibility and popularity, including incidents that allegedly required law enforcement attention. That history changes how people interpret public interactions involving references to harm directed toward her specifically. In modern professional sports, leagues are acutely aware that public online behavior exists inside a much larger information environment where emotionally unstable or highly motivated individuals can interpret social media engagement in dangerous ways. That is exactly why organizations often move aggressively to distance themselves from anything that could be perceived as validating threatening rhetoric, even indirectly. The controversy also deepened after users noticed reports of Hayes allegedly blocking accounts that were reposting screenshots and criticizing her online behavior. For critics, that response did not resolve the underlying issue because the central concern was never simply the backlash itself. It was the original interaction that triggered the backlash in the first place. From their perspective, mass-blocking criticism looked less like accountability and more like an attempt to contain the public fallout without directly addressing the conduct under scrutiny. And now the WNBA faces a difficult institutional question that many fans are debating publicly. If the league is willing to issue discipline in other situations involving public conduct and professionalism, what standard will it apply here? Because regardless of intent, perception, or online exaggeration, the league's response, or lack of response, will inevitably communicate something about where its enforcement priorities actually stand. As the backlash continued growing online, criticism quickly shifted from the original interaction itself to how Tiffany Hayes responded afterward. According to many users following the controversy, Hayes began blocking accounts that were reposting screenshots and calling out what they viewed as immature and deeply unprofessional behavior. For critics, that reaction only intensified the controversy because they believed it demonstrated an unwillingness to directly address the seriousness of the situation. In their view, the issue was never ordinary fan criticism or emotional sports debate. The concern was that a verified professional athlete allegedly interacted publicly with rhetoric interpreted as encouraging or validating off-court harm toward another player. And once that perception took hold online, the story immediately became larger than social media drama. Now the focus increasingly turns toward the institutional responsibilities facing the Golden State Valkyries organization itself. Because whether the league ultimately issues discipline or not, the Valkyries still employ the player whose public conduct has now become part of a highly visible controversy involving player safety concerns and public backlash. That creates a very real operational challenge for the franchise moving forward, especially with future matchups involving the Indiana Fever already expected to carry enormous media attention and emotional intensity. Security planning, public relations strategy, legal review, and internal organizational messaging all become part of the equation once controversies like this enter the national sports conversation. This is no longer just about basketball rivalry clips circulating online. It becomes an institutional issue requiring response planning at multiple levels inside the organization. The pressure on the WNBA itself is also escalating because fans and commentators are now openly tagging league officials, the WNBA Players Association, and commissioner leadership demanding accountability. Online reactions have increasingly framed the situation as one involving not only poor judgment but potential encouragement of hostility and violence through social media engagement. Whether every accusation being thrown around online is fair or not, the league now faces a public perception problem that cannot simply be ignored. In modern professional sports, silence during controversies often becomes interpreted as a statement in itself, especially when previous disciplinary actions in other contexts were handled quickly and publicly. And that leads directly into the consistency question the WNBA cannot easily escape. In the same 7-day stretch, the league reportedly issued discipline against Stephanie White over public criticism directed at officiating. That enforcement process was fast, public, and clearly communicated as part of the league's professionalism standards surrounding coach conduct. The message was straightforward. Public comments violating league expectations could produce immediate consequences. But now the WNBA faces a far more sensitive controversy involving a verified player allegedly engaging positively with content interpreted as referencing off-court violence against another active player. Whether the league determines that conduct warrants formal discipline or not, observers are inevitably going to compare the urgency and seriousness of the response. Because once leagues establish standards publicly, fans, media figures, sponsors, and players immediately begin evaluating whether those standards are being enforced consistently across every situation, especially the most controversial ones. The critical point here is that these two controversies are not remotely equal in severity or institutional implication. One situation involved criticism of officiating, something professional leagues deal with constantly through fines, media policies, and coach conduct rules. The other involves a verified player allegedly engaging publicly with content interpreted as referencing physical harm toward another active player away from the basketball environment entirely. Those situations are fundamentally different in seriousness, and that is exactly why the consistency question surrounding the WNBA's response has become so important. Because if the league moves faster and more aggressively to punish criticism of referees than it does to address conduct tied to player safety concerns, the message that sends publicly becomes extremely difficult to defend from an institutional perspective. And that institutional signal matters far beyond social media arguments. The WNBA is no longer operating as a niche sports league existing outside major corporate scrutiny. The league is now connected to expanding national television exposure, massive sponsorship growth, sports wagering partnerships, and increasingly valuable media rights relationships. Every one of those business relationships depends on the perception that the league is being operated as a serious, professionally managed organization with clear behavioral standards and credible enforcement mechanisms. Corporate partners do not simply evaluate ratings and ticket sales. They evaluate organizational stability, reputational risk, crisis management, and player safety infrastructure. That is why controversies involving public athlete conduct create consequences extending far beyond the original interaction itself. The WNBA Players Association also faces its own complicated institutional responsibility in this situation because its role is not limited to defending players publicly in broad terms. The association exists to protect the professional welfare and personal interests of all players across the league. Caitlin Clark is a member. Tiffany Hayes is also a member. And situations like this test what player protection actually means operationally once conflicts emerge between two active members. Because if one player's documented public conduct creates concerns surrounding another player's personal safety environment, the association eventually has to decide what standards it believes should govern that behavior and how visibly it is willing to defend those standards publicly. From an institutional standpoint, the corrective path for the league office is relatively straightforward, even if the political consequences surrounding it are not. Critics argue that at minimum, the WNBA needs to issue some form of documented public response proportionate to the seriousness of the controversy itself, and do so before the next scheduled matchup between the Indiana Fever and the Golden State Valkyries. Whether that response involves fines, warnings, mandated review, or another disciplinary measure ultimately falls under league discretion. But many observers believe the league's institutional credibility now depends less on the exact punishment and more on whether leadership demonstrates that conduct tied to player safety concerns is being treated seriously at all. For Hayes personally, the accountability path is equally obvious in the eyes of critics, although significantly more difficult from a public relations perspective. Many believe the minimum acceptable response would involve a direct and unambiguous public acknowledgement that engaging with the content was inappropriate, that the response created legitimate concern, and that the backlash surrounding it was understandable given the broader context. What critics do not want to see is deflection, claims of misunderstanding, or continued attempts to simply block criticism without addressing the underlying controversy itself. Because once screenshots and public interactions become part of the national sports conversation, silence alone rarely resolves the reputational damage. But the biggest issue this controversy exposes may actually be structural. The WNBA is rapidly entering a new commercial era with expanding audiences, billion-dollar visibility potential, new franchises, larger sponsorship ecosystems, and dramatically intensified media attention. Yet with that growth comes a corresponding need for stronger institutional infrastructure surrounding media training, social media conduct standards, player education, crisis management, and consistently enforced behavioral policies. Leagues growing at this speed cannot rely on informal expectations anymore. The standards governing athlete conduct must evolve alongside the commercial scale of the business itself. And many observers now believe situations like this reveal a widening gap between the WNBA's explosive commercial ambitions and the institutional systems currently in place to manage controversies operating at that level of visibility. Welcome back to WNBA Pro. Subscribe now and turn on notifications for full coverage of the league's official response, the fallout surrounding this controversy, and the institutional implications heading into the next Fever Valkyries matchup. Then drop your perspective in the comments below. Does Tiffany Hayes' documented social media engagement rise to the level of conduct the league is institutionally obligated to address formally? And does the difference in response speed between this controversy and the discipline involving Stephanie White reveal something larger about the WNBA's actual enforcement priorities? The debate surrounding those questions is only getting bigger from here.